Every parent knows the crushing weight of feeling like they've failed their child. Mark Holloway felt that weight as he led his 11-year-old son Ben into an abandoned church, their only shelter after losing their apartment. The old Gothic building was falling apart, but it was all they had. While cleaning a space to sleep, Ben found something under a loose floorboard near the altar. It was an ancient chest sealed with iron bands. Inside were old papers, land deeds, and documents that proved the town's richest family had stolen $50 million decades ago. What started as two people looking for a place to stay became a fight against powerful enemies who would kill to keep their secrets buried. But some truths are worth the risk. What would you do if you found proof that could change everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. As evening approached, Mark found himself oddly hopeful for the first time in months. Yes, they were homeless. Yes, their situation was desperate. But they had found sanctuary in a place built for exactly that purpose. Perhaps there was something poetic in two broken souls finding shelter in a broken church. Ben had filled several pages in his notebook with architectural details and observations. He showed Mark a sketch of the altar area, noting how the stone steps led up to the raised platform where services had once been held. "There's something different about the floor here," Ben said, pointing to his drawing. "See how these stones don't match the others?" Mark looked where his son indicated. Ben was right. Several stones near the altar appeared newer than the surrounding floor, as if they'd been replaced or reset at some point. "Probably just repairs," Mark said, but he made a mental note of his son's observation. Ben's eye for detail had always been remarkable. As they prepared to spend their first night in the abandoned church, Mark felt a strange mixture of failure and hope. He had failed to maintain their normal life, failed to provide the stability every child deserved, but perhaps this place could offer them something different, not just shelter, but a chance to rebuild from the ground up. Outside, the last light faded from the Gothic windows, and St. Matthew's settled into darkness once again, but now it wasn't empty. Now it sheltered two souls who needed its protection, just as it had sheltered congregations for over a century. Tomorrow, they would begin the work of making this place livable. Tonight, they would rest in the knowledge that they had found refuge in a world that had seemed determined to leave them behind. Ben fell asleep quickly, exhausted by the day's emotions and discoveries. Mark sat beside him in the rectory's library, listening to the old building's nighttime sounds, settling timber, wind through loose boards, the distant hum of electrical systems that still functioned despite years of neglect. For the first time in months, Mark allowed himself to imagine a future beyond mere survival. Perhaps Ben could continue his education through online resources. Perhaps Mark could find work that let him commute from this unlikely home. Perhaps they could restore not just their lives, but this forgotten place that had welcomed them in their darkest hour. The last thing Mark saw before sleep took him was Ben's notebook lying open on the makeshift bedside table. The boy had drawn their new home with remarkable accuracy, capturing both its decay and its enduring beauty. At the bottom of the page, in Ben's careful handwriting, were the words, "Our church, our home, our new beginning." Their second morning in the church dawned grey and humid, the kind of weather that made old buildings feel even more ancient. Mark woke to find Ben already awake, sitting by the library window with his notebook open, sketching the overgrown cemetery that stretched behind the church. The boy had an uncanny ability to find beauty in forgotten places. "Sleep okay?" Mark asked, stretching muscles stiff from sleeping on the hardwood floor despite their makeshift bedding. "I kept thinking about those stones," Ben replied without looking up from his drawing, "the ones by the altar that don't match." Mark had hoped his son might forget about that detail, but Ben's mind worked differently than other children. Where most kids would be overwhelmed by their circumstances, Ben focused on puzzles and patterns. It was both a blessing and a concern. After a breakfast of convenience store pastries and lukewarm water from the kitchen tap, they set about making their sanctuary more livable. Mark had found cleaning supplies in a storage closet, ancient bottles of disinfectant and a mop that had seen better decades. The work would be therapeutic, he decided. Physical labor to keep their minds occupied while they adjusted to their new reality. They started in the rectory, tackling years of dust and debris. Ben worked alongside his father without complaint, his notebook never far from reach. Every so often, he would pause to sketch something that caught his attention. A pattern in the wallpaper, the way light fell through a particular window, the ornate woodwork around door frames. By noon, they had made noticeable progress on 3 rooms. The kitchen now looked habitable, and the library that served as their bedroom had been cleared of spider webs and mouse droppings. Mark felt a genuine sense of accomplishment, the first he'd experienced in months. "Can we work in the church now?" Ben asked during their lunch break. "I want to get a better look at those stones." Mark hesitated. The sanctuary felt sacred somehow, even in its abandoned state. But Ben's curiosity was infectious, and truthfully, Mark was beginning to wonder about those mismatched stones himself. The main sanctuary was cooler than the rectory, its thick stone walls providing natural insulation. Afternoon light filtered through the gaps in the boarded windows, creating dramatic patterns on the dusty pews. Their footsteps echoed in the vast space, making them acutely aware of the building's emptiness. Ben walked directly to the altar area, his notebook in hand. Up close, the discrepancy in the flooring was even more obvious. A roughly rectangular section of stones, perhaps 4 feet by 6 feet, showed different wear patterns and coloring than the surrounding floor. "See, Dad, it's like someone took up the original stones and put new ones down." Mark knelt beside his son, running his hand over the surface. The stones felt different too, smoother, less weathered. "You're right. But why would someone replace just this section?" Ben opened his notebook and began sketching the pattern, noting the exact dimensions and placement. His artistic training had given him an eye for spatial relationships that surprised adults. Maybe something was buried here, or maybe there was damage from water or something. The idea of something being buried beneath the altar sent an unexpected chill through Mark. Churches were often built over burial sites, and this building was old enough that its original construction might have disturbed something. But that was probably just his imagination, influenced by too many late-night horror movies. They spent the afternoon cleaning the sanctuary, working around the pews and altar area. The physical work felt good, purposeful, for the first time since losing his job. Mark felt like he was building something instead of just surviving. Ben worked beside him, occasionally stopping to add details to his notebook sketches. It was Ben who first noticed the loose stone. "Dad, look at this." Ben was kneeling near the altar rail, pointing to one of the replacement stones. "This one moves." Mark joined his son and pressed on the stone Ben indicated. It shifted slightly under pressure, rocking like a loose tooth. The mortar around its edges had cracked and crumbled, leaving gaps that hadn't been visible from a distance. "Probably just settling," Mark said, but his heart rate had increased. Old buildings do that. Ben wasn't satisfied with that explanation. He pressed harder on the stone, working his small fingers into the gaps around its edges. "It's not just loose, Dad. It's like it was meant to come up." Against his better judgment, Mark found himself helping his son investigate the stone. Together, they managed to work it free from its setting. The stone was heavier than expected, requiring both of them to lift it clear of the hole it had occupied. Beneath the stone was a rectangular cavity lined with newer mortar, and at the bottom of that cavity, wrapped in what appeared to be oilcloth, was a metal object about the size of a shoebox. Father and son stared at their discovery in stunned silence. The object was clearly intentionally hidden, placed there by someone who wanted it to remain secret. Mark's first instinct was to replace the stone and forget they had ever seen anything. But Ben was already reaching into the cavity. "Ben, don't—" But His son's curiosity had overcome caution. Ben carefully lifted the wrapped object from its hiding place, surprised by its weight. The oilcloth was old, but had protected its contents from moisture. Whatever was inside had been deliberately preserved. Mark's hands trembled slightly as he helped Ben unwrap their discovery. Layer after layer of oilcloth came away, revealing an ornate wooden box beneath. The box was clearly old, its dark wood polished to a deep shine despite its age. Brass corners and hinges showed the green patina of decades, but the craftsmanship was exceptional. The lid bore an intricate carving of intertwined roses and thorns. "It's beautiful," Ben whispered, running his finger along the carved design. The box had a brass latch, but no visible lock. Mark hesitated, his rational mind warning him that they were about to cross a line they couldn't uncross. But Ben was already working the latch, and Mark found himself unable to stop what was happening. The lid opened with a soft click. Inside, nestled in faded velvet lining, were documents. Lots of documents. Papers of various sizes and ages. Some bound with ribbon, others loose. At first glance, Mark could see what appeared to be official seals, signatures, and the kind of formal handwriting that suggested legal importance. Ben reached for the top document, but Mark caught his hand. "Careful, these might be fragile." Together they carefully lifted the first item from the box. It was a letter, written in the careful script of someone accustomed to formal correspondence. The paper was thick and expensive, the ink faded but still legible. At the top, in elegant letterhead, were the words, "St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, Millbrook." Mark's throat went dry as he read the date. September 15th, 1952. The letter was addressed "to whom it may concern" and signed by someone named Father Jonathan Morrison. The same Father Morrison the local teenagers claimed had disappeared mysteriously, but it was the first line of the letter that made Mark's hands begin to shake. "If you are reading this, then my suspicions about the Blackwood family have likely cost me my life, and the truth must finally be told." Ben looked up at his father, his young face serious beyond his years. "Dad, what does this mean?" Mark stared at the letter, his mind racing. They had stumbled onto something that was clearly meant to remain hidden, something that involved the most powerful family in town, something that a priest had literally taken to his grave, or tried to. "I think," Mark said carefully, "we've found something that was never supposed to be found." The box contained dozens of other documents. Mark could see what appeared to be bank records, property deeds, and official-looking papers with seals and stamps. Each item they examined seemed to build towards some larger truth that Father Morrison had been desperate to preserve. As the afternoon faded into evening, Mark and Ben sat on the dusty floor of the abandoned church, surrounded by secrets that were decades old. The weight of their discovery was beginning to settle on Mark's shoulders. This wasn't just a curious find. This was evidence of something significant enough that a man had hidden it and potentially died for it. Ben continued sketching in his notebook, now documenting not just architectural details, but their archaeological discovery. His young mind seemed to accept the mystery as simply another puzzle to be solved, but Mark understood the implications more clearly. They had found something that powerful people had wanted to remain buried. And if Father Morrison's letter was accurate, those same people might be willing to go to great lengths to keep it that way. "What do we do now?" Ben asked, carefully replacing the letter in the box. Mark looked at his son, then at the documents that could change everything, or destroy them both. They were homeless, powerless, and completely alone, but they had also stumbled onto what might be the most important discovery in the town's history. "First," Mark said, "we read everything. We figure out exactly what Father Morrison wanted the world to know. Then we decide what to do about it." As night fell over St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, Mark and Ben began the careful process of examining each document in the wooden box. Outside, the town of Millbrook continued its quiet existence. unaware that two desperate souls had just unearthed secrets that could shake its very foundation. The iron-bound chest that Ben had initially seen turned out to be a smaller wooden box, but its contents were no less explosive. Father Morrison had been very thorough in his documentation, very careful in his preservation of evidence, and very prescient in his fear that the truth might cost him everything. Mark held his son close as they began to read, both of them understanding that their lives had just changed forever. They had come to this place seeking shelter. Instead, they had found a responsibility that neither of them had asked for, but that neither of them could ignore. The abandoned church around them seemed to approve, its ancient walls holding their secret as they had held so many others. But this secret was different. This one was meant to see the light of day, no matter how dangerous that might prove to be. Father Morrison's confession letter proved to be just the beginning. As Mark and Ben carefully examined each document by the light of their phone flashlights, a picture emerged that was far more complex and disturbing than either had imagined. The letter itself was methodical in its accusations. Father Morrison wrote with the precision of a man who knew his words might be his final testimony. He detailed conversations overheard in the confessional, financial records that didn't align with official reports, and patterns of behavior that painted the Blackwood family as something far different from the benevolent civic leaders they appeared to be. The Blackwood fortune, Morrison had written in his careful script, was built not on honest business dealings, but on a systematic theft from this community that spans 3 generations. What began as wartime profiteering in 1917 evolved into something far more insidious, the deliberate impoverishment of working families to feed an insatiable greed. Ben read over his father's shoulder, his notebook open beside him, as he sketched reproductions of the documents, seals and letterheads. The boy's artistic eye captured details that Mark might have missed. Subtle differences in ink color that suggested some documents had been altered, signatures that didn't quite match across different papers. The most damning piece of evidence was a carbon copy of a letter Morrison had apparently sent to the State Attorney General's office in 1952. In it, he outlined specific accusations against Vincent Blackwood Sr., the current Vincent Blackwood Jr.'s grandfather. The charges were serious: embezzlement of federal funds designated for post-war reconstruction, fraudulent land deals that displaced poor families, and the systematic destruction of documents that could prove the family's crimes. "Dad, look at this," Ben said, pointing to a paragraph near the bottom of Morrison's letter. "He says he sent copies of all this evidence to 3 different people, but if that's true, why didn't anything happen?" It was a perceptive question. Mark studied the letter more carefully, noting Morrison's references to backup copies sent to the Attorney General, a newspaper editor in the state capital, and someone identified only as MC in Chicago. Maybe the Attorney General was bought off, Mark mused, or maybe the evidence never reached the right people. The next document in the box provided a possible answer. It was a telegram dated October 3rd, 1952, addressed to Father Morrison. "Regret to inform Attorney General files destroyed in office fire. Stop investigation impossible without documentation. Stop suggest you maintain evidence safely. Stop." Ben's eyes widened as he read the telegram. Someone burned the evidence? Mark felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool air in the church. The timeline was becoming clear. Morrison had tried to expose the Blackwood family through official channels. When that failed, he had hidden his evidence and apparently planned to try again. But before he could act, he had disappeared. The wooden box contained nearly 30 other documents, each one adding another piece to the puzzle Morrison had tried to preserve. Bank records showed large cash withdrawals with no corresponding legitimate business expenses. Property deeds revealed that the Blackwoods had acquired valuable land for far below market value, often from families in financial distress. Most disturbing were the personal letters from townspeople pleading for help with debts that seemed to multiply no matter how much they paid. One letter, dated July 1951, came from a widow named Eleanor Hayes. "Father Morrison, I don't know where else to turn. My husband died owing Mr. Blackwood $300 for medical bills. Now they say I owe $800, with interest and fees I never agreed to. They're threatening to take our house unless I sign papers giving them the deed. My children have nowhere else to go." Ben carefully copied the letter's key phrases into his notebook. "This sounds like what happened to us, doesn't it, Dad? People who couldn't pay their debts, losing everything?" Mark nodded grimly. The parallels were uncomfortable. How many families over the decades had found themselves trapped by Blackwood financial manipulations? How many had lost their homes, their livelihoods, their futures to feed the family's growing wealth? As they continued reading, a pattern emerged that was both systematic and ruthless. The Blackwoods would identify vulnerable families, recent immigrants, widows, people with medical emergencies, and offer them loans at seemingly reasonable terms. But the contracts contained clauses that allowed for arbitrary fee increases, accelerated payment schedules, and property seizure for minor infractions. Father Morrison had documented case after case, preserving letters, contracts, and testimonies from victims who had trusted him with their stories. His role as a priest had made him a natural confidant for people in crisis, and he had used that position to build an extensive record of the family's predatory practices. But the most shocking revelation came in a document near the bottom of the box. It was a photocopy of a federal contract dated 1943, bearing the seal of the U.S. War Department. The contract authorized payment of $2.3 million to Blackwood Industries for the manufacture of military equipment during World War II. Attached to the contract was Morrison's handwritten analysis, supported by shipping records and production reports. According to the priest's calculations, Vincent Blackwood Sr. had received full payment for equipment that was never manufactured. The money had been diverted to personal accounts, while substandard or non-existent materials were delivered to the military. "Dad," Ben whispered, his voice carrying the weight of understanding beyond his years. "People could have died because of this. Soldiers who didn't get the equipment they needed." Mark stared at the documents, feeling the full enormity of what they had discovered. This wasn't just local corruption, it was treason. And if Morrison's evidence was accurate, the Blackwood fortune had been built partially on money stolen from the American war effort. The final document in Morrison's collection was perhaps the most personal. It was a copy of his resignation letter to the bishop, dated September 20th, 1952, 5 days after his confession letter and just weeks before his disappearance. "Your Grace," Morrison had written, "I can no longer serve as pastor of St. Matthew's, knowing what I know and doing nothing about it. The Blackwood family has corrupted this community at its very heart, and my attempts to seek justice through proper channels have been thwarted at every turn. I fear for my safety, but I fear more for my soul if I remain silent while such evil flourishes under my watch." The letter went on to explain Morrison's plan to contact federal authorities directly, bypassing the state officials he suspected had been compromised. He had arranged to meet with FBI agents in the state capital, bringing with him copies of all his evidence. But Morrison had never made it to that meeting. Ben closed his notebook and looked at his father with solemn eyes. He tried to do the right thing, and they killed him for it. Mark wanted to tell his son that they couldn't know that for certain, but the evidence seemed overwhelming. Morrison had gathered proof of serious crimes, attempted to report them through official channels, been blocked at every turn, and then disappeared when he tried to go over the heads of local authorities. The abandoned church around them suddenly felt less like sanctuary and more like a tomb. They were sitting in the same building where Father Morrison had made his final plans, surrounded by the evidence he had died trying to expose. The weight of that responsibility settled on Mark's shoulders like a lead blanket. "What do we do?" Ben asked quietly. It was the same question his son had posed the day before, but now it carried far more weight. They weren't just homeless anymore. They were the guardians of secrets that powerful people had killed to protect. And unlike Father Morrison, they had no official position, no community standing, no resources to ensure the truth would survive if something happened to them. Mark carefully returned Morrison's confession letter to its place in the wooden box. The priest's careful handwriting seemed to accuse him. Across the decades, Morrison had tried to do the right thing alone and had paid for it with his life. But maybe that was the key. Maybe he had failed because he had tried to fight the Blackwoods by himself. First, Mark said, echoing his words from the previous evening, we make sure this evidence can't disappear again. We make copies, lots of copies. We find people we can trust, people who aren't connected to the Blackwoods or their influence. Ben nodded seriously. And then? Mark looked around the abandoned sanctuary, at the altar where Morrison had delivered his final sermons, at the pews where his congregation had sat unknowingly while their pastor gathered evidence of their community's corruption. Then we finish what Father Morrison started. We make sure the truth finally sees the light of day. As they carefully repacked the wooden box, Mark tried to push down the fear that was building in his chest. They were about to challenge the most powerful family in town, people who had demonstrated their willingness to destroy anyone who threatened their secrets. But they had something Morrison hadn't. They had each other, and they had the advantage of being invisible to the Blackwood family's notice, at least for now. The church bells in the town square chimed midnight as Mark and Ben settled in for their second night in St. Matthew's. But sleep didn't come easily. Every sound in the old building seemed magnified, every creak and groan a potential threat. They had found shelter in this abandoned church, but they had also inherited its darkest secret. Outside, Millbrook slept peacefully, unaware that two desperate souls had just uncovered evidence of crimes that reached back 70 years. The Blackwood name continued to grace half the buildings in town, a testament to their civic generosity and community leadership. But Mark and Ben knew the truth now, and with that knowledge came a burden that would change both of their lives forever. The next morning brought practical considerations that couldn't be ignored. Mark needed to find work, any work, to buy food and basic supplies. But the discovery of Morrison's evidence had changed everything. Every decision now carried weight beyond simple survival. Over breakfast, stale donuts from a gas station, Mark and Ben discussed their next steps. The original land deeds Morrison had preserved were particularly compelling evidence, showing a pattern of fraudulent property acquisitions dating back to the 1920s. The documents revealed how the Blackwood family had systematically targeted immigrant families and war widows using predatory lending practices to seize valuable property for pennies on the dollar. We need someone who understands what these documents mean, Mark said, studying a particularly complex property transfer. From 1934, someone who knows about historical records and legal documents. Ben looked up from his notebook where he had been sketching detailed reproductions of the land deeds official seals. What about the library? They have a local history section, right? Maybe someone there could help. It was a good suggestion. But Mark hesitated. Visiting the library meant leaving their sanctuary, exposing themselves to the normal life of the town. It also meant potentially alerting others to their interest in historical records. But they needed expert help to understand the full implications of Morrison's evidence. The Millbrook Public Library sat on Main Street, 3 blocks from the church. Mark had visited it occasionally during his teaching years, researching lesson plans and local history for his students. The head librarian was Margaret Chen, a woman in her early 60s who had moved to Millbrook 20 years ago to catalogue the town's historical archives. Mark remembered Margaret as thorough and discreet, someone who took her professional responsibilities seriously. If anyone in town could help them understand Morrison's documents without immediately alerting the wrong people, it would be her. They walked to the library in the late morning after the initial rush of patrons had settled. Mark carried Morrison's wooden box in a backpack, feeling exposed and vulnerable on the street. Every car that passed seemed to slow down. Every face they encountered appeared suspicious, but Millbrook looked exactly as it always had. Quiet streets, well-maintained buildings, and the ever-present Blackwood name on foundations and plaques. The family's philanthropy was everywhere, a constant reminder of their supposed generosity and civic commitment. Margaret Chen was working alone in the reference section when they arrived. She looked up with professional curiosity as Mark approached, her expression shifting to concern when she recognized him. "Mr. Holloway, I heard about your situation. I'm so sorry about the teaching position." Her voice carried genuine sympathy. "How are you and Ben managing?" Mark appreciated her directness. "We're getting by. Actually, that's partly why we're here. We've found some historical documents, and I was hoping you might help us understand their significance." Margaret's eyes brightened with professional interest. "Local history documents. I'd be happy to take a look. The town's records are somewhat scattered, so any new historical material is potentially valuable." Mark glanced around the empty reference section and lowered his voice. "These documents might be sensitive. They relate to some prominent local families, and I want to make sure we handle them properly." Understanding flickered in Margaret's eyes. 20 years in Millbrook had taught her about the delicate balance of small-town politics and family reputations. "Perhaps we should use my office, more private." Margaret's office was cramped but organized, with floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with local history materials. Mark carefully removed Morrison's wooden box from his backpack, noting how Margaret's expression changed when she saw the ornate carving on the lid. "That's beautiful craftsmanship. 19th century, I'd guess. Where did you find it?" "In the old church," Mark said carefully. "St. Matthew's. We've been staying there temporarily, and Ben noticed some loose stones near the altar." Ben opened his notebook and showed Margaret his sketches of the church interior and the hidden cavity where they'd found the box. Her eyes widened as she studied his detailed drawings. "You have quite an eye for architectural detail," she told Ben. "These drawings are remarkably accurate. I've studied that church's construction records. It was built in 1887, designed by a prominent Gothic revival architect." Margaret's professional demeanor shifted as Mark opened the wooden box and revealed Morrison's documents. She immediately recognized the letterhead from St. Matthew's, and her breath caught when she saw Father Morrison's signature. "Jonathan Morrison," she whispered. "I've wondered what happened to him. The church records just show that he resigned in 1952, but no one seemed to know where he went or why he left so suddenly." Mark handed her Morrison's confession letter. Margaret read it slowly, her expression growing more serious with each paragraph. When she finished, she looked up with troubled eyes. "This is extraordinary and deeply concerning. Father Morrison was accusing the Blackwood family of systematic fraud going back decades." "Is it credible?" Mark asked. "I mean, could these accusations be accurate?" Margaret was quiet for several minutes, studying the document more carefully. "The letterhead is authentic. I've seen Morrison's correspondence in the church archives. The writing style matches other documents from that period. And honestly, some of these accusations align with questions I've had about certain property transfers in the historical records." She reached for a thick folder from her desk drawer. "I've been working on a comprehensive property ownership map of the town, tracking how land changed hands over the decades. There are some curious patterns in the Blackwood acquisitions. Valuable properties purchased well below market value, often from families in financial distress." Ben showed Margaret his notebook sketches of the land deeds from Morrison's collection. She studied them intently, occasionally referencing her own records. Her frown deepened as she compared the documents. "These deeds are definitely authentic," she said finally. "The seals, the signatures, the paper quality, all consistent with documents from that era. But more importantly, they fill in gaps in the official record. Some of these transactions don't appear in the current property records at all." Mark felt his heart rate increase. "What does that mean?" "It means someone has been very careful about controlling the historical narrative. Official records that might embarrass the Blackwood family have been removed or altered over the years, but Morrison preserved the original documents. Margaret continued examining the evidence, her professional excitement warring with obvious concern about the implications. The federal wartime contract was particularly compelling. She had been researching Millbrook's World War II industrial contributions and had wondered about inconsistencies in the production records. According to the official history, Blackwood Industries was a major defense contractor during the war, she explained, but I could never find detailed production records or shipping manifests. Now I understand why. The equipment was never manufactured. Ben leaned forward in his chair. So Father Morrison was right? The Blackwoods really did steal all that money? Margaret nodded slowly. Based on these documents, it appears so. And if the pattern Morrison documented continued beyond 1952, the scope of the fraud could be enormous. The implications hung heavy in the small office. They were looking at evidence of crimes that spanned generations, involving millions of dollars, and dozens of victim families. The Blackwood fortune, the family's civic prominence, their charitable foundations, all of it potentially built on systematic theft. What should we do? Mark asked. Morrison tried to report this to the authorities in 1952, but his evidence disappeared and so did he. How do we make sure that doesn't happen again? Margaret was quiet for a long time, clearly weighing her professional responsibilities against the potential dangers of becoming involved. Finally, she spoke with careful deliberation. First, we need to preserve these documents. I can help you make high-quality copies, including digital scans that can be distributed widely if necessary. We should also research whether any of Morrison's original contacts might still be alive. The newspaper editor he mentioned, the person in Chicago. She paused, looking directly at Mark. But you need to understand the risks. If Morrison was killed for trying to expose this, you could be in real danger. The Blackwood family has had 70 years to consolidate their power and eliminate threats to their secrets. Mark glanced at Ben, who was listening with the intense focus that characterized his approach to everything. His son deserved a normal childhood, not a life spent looking over his shoulder for enemies they couldn't see coming, but they also couldn't ignore what they had found. Morrison had died trying to protect this evidence, trying to ensure that someday the truth would be told. If Mark and Ben walked away now, those deaths, Morrison's and potentially others over the decades, would be meaningless. We'll be careful, Mark said finally. But we can't pretend we never found this. Too many people have been hurt by the Blackwood family's crimes. Someone needs to speak for them. Margaret nodded with what appeared to be relief. Then we'll do this right, methodically, carefully, with multiple safeguards, and we'll make sure the truth survives even if something happens to any of us. As they spent the rest of the afternoon, making copies and planning their next steps, Mark felt both hope and dread building in equal measure. They had found an ally in Margaret Chen, someone with the expertise and resources to help them navigate the complex process of exposing historical crimes. But they had also committed themselves to a path that could destroy their lives or end them. Outside Margaret's office window, the town of Millbrook continued its peaceful existence, unaware that 3 people in a library were preparing to tear down the foundation of its most prominent family's reputation. The original land deeds sat on Margaret's desk like accusations waiting to be heard. Each document represented families destroyed, lives ruined, dreams crushed by systematic greed. Father Morrison had preserved their stories, had died trying to tell them. Now it was up to Mark, Ben, and Margaret to finish what he had started, no matter what the cost. Margaret's recommendation led them to Sarah Rodriguez, a civil rights attorney who specialized in historical injustice cases. Sarah had built her career on complex litigation involving decades-old crimes, land fraud, discriminatory lending, and institutional corruption cases that other lawyers considered too difficult or unprofitable to pursue. Her office occupied the top floor of a converted warehouse in the county seat, 30 miles from Millbrook. Mark and Ben made the drive in their aging Honda, Morrison's evidence carefully secured in the trunk. Margaret had insisted on coming with them, bringing additional documentation from the library's archives to support their case. Sarah Rodriguez was younger than Mark had expected, perhaps 45, with greying hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to fighting powerful opponents. Her office walls displayed dozens of framed newspaper articles documenting legal victories against corporations and government agencies that had thought themselves untouchable. "Margaret spoke with me yesterday about your situation," Sarah said. After they had settled into chairs around her conference table, she mentioned historical documents related to the Blackwood family. "I have to admit that name caught my attention." Mark felt his pulse quicken. "You know about the Blackwoods?" "I know their reputation. Vincent Blackwood Jr. sits on the boards of several major corporations, serves as a trustee for 3 different charitable foundations, and has significant political connections at the state level. From a legal perspective, that makes him a formidable opponent." Sarah's directness was both reassuring and frightening. At least she understood what they were up against. Ben opened his notebook and showed her his sketches of the church and the hidden documents, explaining how they had made their discovery. "Remarkable detective work," Sarah told Ben. "Your attention to detail could be crucial if this case goes to trial." She examined Morrison's confession letter with the same careful attention Margaret had given it, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. When she reached the section detailing the wartime contract fraud, her expression grew particularly serious. "Federal contract fraud has no statute of limitations when it involves defense contracts during wartime," she explained. "If Morrison's evidence is accurate, the Blackwood family could still face criminal prosecution for those World War II crimes." The banking ledgers from the 1920s proved equally compelling. Sarah spread them across her conference table, cross-referencing account numbers with Morrison's annotations and Margaret's property records. The pattern of systematic theft became undeniable when viewed in aggregate. "This is extraordinary documentation," Sarah said finally. "Father Morrison was building a federal racketeering case 70 years before RICO statutes existed. He understood that the Blackwood crimes weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a deliberate, ongoing criminal enterprise." Mark felt both vindicated and terrified. Having a professional attorney validate Morrison's evidence made the accusations more real, but it also made the danger more immediate. "What are our options?" he asked. Sarah was quiet for several minutes, studying the documents and making calculations on her legal pad. When she looked up, her expression was grave. "We have several possible approaches, each with different risks and potential outcomes. We could file criminal complaints with federal authorities. The FBI has jurisdiction over the wartime contract fraud, and the IRS would be interested in the tax evasion implications." She turned to a fresh page on her legal pad. "We could also pursue civil litigation on behalf of the victim families Morrison documented. Many of their descendants still live in the area, and they would have legitimate claims for restitution." Ben raised his hand like he was still in school. "What about just telling everyone, like in the newspapers?" Sarah smiled at his directness. "That's actually not a bad strategy. Public disclosure could force official investigations and make it harder for evidence to disappear again, but it's also the most dangerous approach for you personally." Margaret leaned forward in her chair. "What do you mean?" "Father Morrison tried to work through official channels, and he disappeared. If we go public with these accusations, we lose the element of surprise. The Blackwood family would have time to mount a defense, discredit the evidence, or potentially eliminate the people making the accusations." The word eliminate hung in the air like a physical presence. Mark thought about Ben sleeping peacefully in the abandoned church, trusting his father to keep him safe. How could he justify putting his son in danger, even for the sake of justice? But Sarah wasn't finished with her analysis. However, there's also significant protection in public exposure. Once these documents are widely known, it becomes much harder to make the problem go away quietly. The key is making sure multiple copies of the evidence are distributed simultaneously to journalists, law enforcement, and public officials. As they discussed strategy, Sarah's phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID and frowned. "Excuse me. This is unusual. I need to take this." Mark watched Sarah's expression grow increasingly troubled as she listened to the caller. When she hung up, her face was pale. "That was my contact at the State Attorney General's office. Someone made inquiries yesterday about whether I was representing clients with interests adverse to the Blackwood family." The room fell silent. Margaret was the first to speak. "How could they know already?" Sarah's voice was carefully controlled. "Either someone saw you coming here, or your research at the library attracted attention. Small towns have ways of communicating that we might not have anticipated." Mark felt ice forming in his stomach. "What does this mean?" "It means we've lost the element of surprise. The Blackwood family knows someone is investigating their history, and they're trying to identify potential threats." Ben looked up from his notebook, where he had been sketching the banking ledgers. "Are we in trouble?" Sarah's expression softened as she addressed the 11-year-old. "Not trouble exactly, Ben, but we need to be very careful about our next steps." She turned back to Mark and Margaret. "I'm going to recommend we accelerate our timeline. If they're already looking for us, waiting could be more dangerous than acting quickly." Over the next hour, they developed a comprehensive plan. Sarah would simultaneously file complaints with 3 different federal agencies: the FBI, IRS, and Department of Justice. Margaret would contact journalists at major newspapers in the state capital and Chicago. Mark would reach out to descendants of Morrison's documented victims, building a coalition of families with legitimate grievances. Most importantly, they would make multiple copies of all evidence and distribute them to trusted contacts across the country. If the Blackwood family tried to suppress the investigation, they would find themselves fighting on too many fronts simultaneously. "There's one more thing," Sarah said as they prepared to leave. "You can't go back to the church. If they've identified you as a threat, that's the first place they'll look." Mark's heart sank. The abandoned church had been their sanctuary, their home when they had nowhere else to go. More than that, it was where Morrison had hidden his evidence, where their entire investigation had begun. "Where can we go?" Sarah made a quick phone call, then turned back to them. "I have a colleague who operates a safe house network for witnesses in dangerous cases. She can provide temporary accommodation while we get this information into the right hands." As they packed up Morrison's documents, Mark felt the weight of responsibility settling more heavily on his shoulders. 3 days ago, he and Ben had been homeless and desperate, seeking nothing more than shelter from an indifferent world. Now they were key witnesses in a case that could destroy one of the most powerful families in the region. Ben seemed to understand the gravity of their situation. He carefully secured his notebook in his backpack, making sure all his sketches and observations were protected. The boy had documented their entire journey, creating a visual record that could prove crucial if their testimony was ever questioned. Before they left Sarah's office, she made one final call to her contact at the FBI. Mark listened to her side of the conversation, catching fragments about historical fraud, federal contracts, and witness protection. When she hung up, Sarah's expression was more hopeful. "Agent Patricia Walsh is driving down from the state capitol tonight. She specializes in cold cases involving federal crimes, and she's very interested in Morrison's evidence." The drive to the safe house took them through rural countryside that Mark had never seen before. Rolling hills covered with late summer, crops stretched to the horizon, broken occasionally by farmhouses and red barns that spoke of simpler times and honest work. Ben spent the drive adding details to his sketches, occasionally asking Margaret questions about the historical context of Morrison's documents. His young mind was processing the complexity of their situation with remarkable maturity, finding patterns and connections that surprised the adults. The safe house turned out to be a converted farmhouse owned by Sarah's colleague, Jennifer Walsh, Agent Walsh's sister, as it happened. Jennifer had been providing secure accommodation for witnesses and victims of violent crimes for over a decade, turning her family's rural property into an unofficial refuge. "You'll be safe here," Jennifer assured them as she showed them to comfortable bedrooms on the second floor. "The property is monitored. We have excellent security systems, and my sister's federal colleagues know where you are." That evening, as Mark and Ben settled into their temporary sanctuary, they reflected on how dramatically their lives had changed. 4 days ago, they had been evicted from their apartment. Now they were under federal protection, preparing to testify against a family whose crimes might stretch back nearly a century. Ben sat by the farmhouse window, sketching the sunset over the surrounding fields. "Dad, do you think Father Morrison would be proud of what we're doing?" Mark looked at his son, this remarkable boy who had discovered the evidence, documented their investigation, and faced danger with courage beyond his years. "I think he'd be very proud, son, and I think he'd be grateful that his sacrifice finally meant something." Outside, Agent Walsh's sedan pulled into the farmhouse driveway, headlights cutting through the gathering darkness. Tomorrow, they would begin the process of bringing Morrison's evidence into official channels, starting a chain of events that could not be reversed. The banking ledgers that had documented decades of financial crimes sat securely in Sarah's office, safe, protected by multiple security systems and armed guards. But more importantly, they were no longer secrets buried beneath the altar of an abandoned church. Father Morrison's truth was finally ready to see the light of day, carried forward by a homeless teacher, his observant son, a dedicated librarian, and a fearless attorney. The Blackwood family's 70-year reign of hidden corruption was about to face its greatest challenge. Agent Patricia Walsh arrived at the farmhouse just after dawn, bringing with her a team of federal investigators and forensic specialists. Mark watched from the kitchen window as unmarked vehicles filled the driveway, their occupants moving with the purposeful efficiency of professionals accustomed to high-stakes cases. Agent Walsh herself was a woman in her early 50s, with silver hair and the steady demeanor of someone who had spent decades pursuing complex white-collar crimes. She shook hands with Mark and Ben formally, then settled into the farmhouse's living room, with Morrison's evidence spread across multiple tables. "I've been investigating historical fraud cases for 23 years, she told them. "I've never seen documentation this comprehensive from the 1950s. Father Morrison understood evidence preservation better than most modern investigators. The photograph collection that Morrison had assembled proved particularly powerful. Each image told a story of families destroyed by Blackwood predatory lending, children standing beside repossessed homes, elderly couples forced to move in with relatives after losing property they'd owned for decades, immigrants who had trusted the wrong people with their American dreams. Ben studied the photographs intently, occasionally sketching faces and details. In his notebook, Agent Walsh noticed his careful attention to the images and asked to see his drawings. "These are remarkable," she said, examining Ben's reproductions of the victims' faces. "You've captured expressions and details that could be crucial for identifying descendants and building our victim database." Over the next several hours, Agent Walsh's team methodically photographed, catalogued, and analyzed every document in Morrison's collection. They used portable scanners to create high-resolution digital copies, ensuring that the evidence would survive even if the originals were somehow destroyed. "The federal contract fraud is our strongest case," Agent Walsh explained as her team worked. Defense Department records from World War II are meticulously maintained, and we can cross-reference Morrison's documentation with official production reports and payment records. She showed them computer printouts of wartime documents her team had already retrieved from federal archives. The comparison with Morrison's evidence was damning. Payments had been authorized for equipment that was never manufactured, while substandard materials were delivered to military units preparing for combat. Soldiers died because of this, Agent Walsh said quietly. American boys went into battle with defective equipment because Vincent Blackwood Sr. was more interested in profit than national defense. The emotional weight of that revelation settled over the room. This wasn't just about financial crimes or property fraud. It was about betraying the country during its greatest crisis, putting personal greed ahead of the lives of young men fighting for freedom. Margaret had brought additional materials from the library's archives, including newspaper clippings from the 1940s and 1950s that provided context for the Blackwood family's rise to prominence. The articles painted Vincent Blackwood Sr. as a patriotic industrialist, praised for his contributions to the war effort and his subsequent investment in community development. But viewed alongside Morrison's evidence, the newspaper coverage appeared to be carefully orchestrated propaganda. The Blackwood family had used their stolen wealth to buy respectability, funding charitable causes and civic improvements that obscured the criminal foundation of their fortune. This is a classic pattern in organized crime families, Agent Walsh observed. Use illegal profits to purchase legitimate social standing, then leverage that respectability to commit more crimes. The Blackwoods have been running this playbook for 3 generations. Around noon, Sarah Rodriguez arrived with disturbing news. Her office had been broken into during the night, with the intruders specifically targeting the file cabinets where Morrison's documents had been stored. Nothing else was taken. Not computers, not cash from petty change, not any of the valuable legal materials related to other cases. Professional job, Sarah reported grimly. They knew exactly what they were looking for and where to find it. If we hadn't already moved the originals here, we would have lost everything. Agent Walsh's expression darkened. That confirms we're dealing with sophisticated opposition. The Blackwood family has resources and connections we need to take seriously. She made several phone calls, coordinating with other federal agencies and requesting additional security for everyone involved in the investigation. By afternoon, the farmhouse had been transformed into a temporary command center with FBI technicians, setting up secure communication equipment and forensic specialists processing evidence. Ben adapted to the controlled chaos with remarkable composure, continuing his documentation work while federal agents bustled around him. Agent Walsh had assigned him an official role as a civilian consultant, recognizing that his artistic skills and observational abilities were genuinely valuable to their investigation. You see details that adults miss, she explained to Ben. That's a real gift, and it could help us find connections we wouldn't discover otherwise. That afternoon brought their first contact with Blackwood family descendants of Morrison's documented victims. Margaret had used her library resources to trace family histories, identifying current relatives of people who had lost property to fraudulent Blackwood schemes decades earlier. The first family to arrive at the farmhouse was the Hayes family, descendants of Eleanor Hayes, the widow whose desperate letter Morrison had preserved. Her great-granddaughter Maria Hayes Thompson was a teacher in the next county who had grown up hearing family stories about property that had been stolen by rich people during her great-grandmother's lifetime. We always wondered what really happened, Maria said, as she examined Morrison's copy of her great-grandmother's letter. Grandma Eleanor died when I was young, but my grandmother used to say the family had once owned valuable land downtown that was taken from them unfairly. Agent Walsh showed Maria the property deeds Morrison had preserved, documents that proved the Hayes family had indeed owned prime commercial real estate that was now part of the Blackwood business district. The fraud had cost Eleanor Hayes's descendants millions of dollars in generational wealth. Other victim families arrived throughout the afternoon. The Kowalskis, whose immigrant grandfather had lost his small business to predatory lending. The Washingtons, whose family farm had been foreclosed through fraudulent debt manipulation. The O'Briens, whose father had died in World War II while using defective equipment manufactured by Blackwood Industries. Each family brought their own pieces of the puzzle: old letters, faded photographs, family stories passed down through generations. Ben documented everything, creating a visual archive that captured both the evidence and the human cost of the Blackwood crimes. "This isn't just about money," Maria Hayes Thompson observed as the victim families shared their stories. "It's about justice for people who never had the power to fight back." As evening approached, Agent Walsh received a call that changed the dynamics of their investigation. Vincent Blackwood Jr. had contacted the FBI directly, requesting a meeting to discuss historical misunderstandings related to his family's business activities. "He wants to negotiate," Agent Walsh explained to the group. "That suggests he's aware of our evidence and concerned about criminal prosecution." Mark felt a mixture of vindication and apprehension. Blackwood's willingness to negotiate proved that Morrison's evidence was genuinely threatening to the family's interests. But it also meant they were no longer operating in secret. The most powerful man in the county knew exactly who they were. "And what they had found. What do we do?" Mark asked. Agent Walsh's smile was coldly professional. "We listen to what he has to say. But we don't negotiate away justice for the families his predecessors destroyed." That night, as Mark and Ben settled into their secure accommodations, they reflected on the extraordinary day. Federal agents were treating them as key witnesses in a major criminal investigation. Victim families were looking to them for justice that had been delayed for decades. And somewhere in his mansion on Hill Street, Vincent Blackwood Jr. was probably making desperate plans to contain a scandal that threatened to destroy his family's carefully constructed reputation. The photograph collection that had moved them so deeply now occupied an evidence table in the farmhouse living room, each image tagged and catalogued by FBI specialists. The faces of Morrison's documented victims seemed to watch over their investigation, silent testimonies to crimes that demanded accountability. Ben's notebook had grown thick with sketches and observations, creating a comprehensive visual record of their journey from homeless desperation to federal witness protection. His artistic documentation would become part of the official case file, preserved for history alongside Morrison's original evidence. Father Morrison's sacrifice was finally bearing fruit 70 years after his disappearance. The truth he had died protecting was spreading beyond the ability of any family to contain or destroy, carried forward by people who understood that justice delayed was not justice denied. The meeting with Vincent Blackwood Jr. was scheduled for the next morning. At the federal building in the state capitol, Agent Walsh had arranged for Mark, Ben, and the victim family representatives to observe the interview through a one-way window, while she and two other federal agents questioned the man whose family they had spent days investigating, Vincent. Blackwood Jr. arrived precisely on time, accompanied by 3 attorneys and carrying himself with the confident bearing of a man accustomed to controlling every situation he entered. He was in his early 60s, impeccably dressed, with silver hair and the kind of commanding presence that came from a lifetime of wealth and influence. But as Mark watched through the observation window, he noticed something unexpected in Blackwood's demeanor. The man appeared genuinely surprised by some of the evidence Agent Walsh presented, not defensive or evasive, but confused, as if he were seeing certain documents for the first time. "I'm familiar with some of these allegations," Blackwood said, as he examined Morrison's confession letter. "Father Morrison approached my grandfather in 1952 with similar accusations. But I was led to believe those issues had been resolved through proper legal channels." Agent Walsh leaned forward. "Resolved how?" "My grandfather hired independent auditors to review the business records Morrison questioned. According to family documents, they found no evidence of impropriety. Morrison's disappearance was unfortunate, but we assumed he had chosen to relocate rather than face potential defamation charges. This wasn't the response any of them had expected." Vincent Blackwood Jr. was either an exceptional actor or he genuinely believed his family's version of events. Agent Walsh pressed harder, showing him the federal wartime contracts and production records. Blackwood's reaction was immediate and visceral. His face paled as he studied the documents, and his hands began to tremble slightly. These production records, they don't match what I was told about our wartime operations. According to family history, Blackwood Industries exceeded all production quotas and received commendations from the War Department. One of his attorneys leaned over to whisper urgently in his ear, but Blackwood waved him away. I need to understand this. If these documents are authentic, then everything I've believed about my family's history is wrong. Agent Walsh exchanged glances with her colleagues, sensing an opportunity. Would you be willing to provide access to your family's private records? Documents that might help us verify or refute the allegations Father Morrison made? Blackwood was quiet for several minutes, clearly wrestling with implications that were reshaping his understanding of his own legacy. Finally, he nodded slowly. If crimes were committed, they need to be addressed. I won't protect criminal activity, even if it involves my own family. During the lunch break, Mark and Ben walked with Agent Walsh through the federal building's corridors, processing what they had witnessed. Blackwood's apparent shock at seeing Morrison's evidence suggested possibilities they hadn't considered. He seemed genuinely surprised, Mark observed, like he really didn't know about the wartime contract fraud. Agent Walsh nodded thoughtfully. That's possible. Family businesses often maintain different narratives for different generations. The people who commit crimes create cover stories to protect their descendants from guilt or legal liability. Ben looked up from his notebook, where he had been sketching Vincent Blackwood's facial expressions during the morning's interview. But if he didn't know, then maybe he's not the real bad guy. It was a perceptive question that went to the heart of their investigation. Were they pursuing justice against people who were genuinely guilty? Or were they attacking someone who had inherited crimes without understanding their true nature? The afternoon session provided partial answers to that question, and the revelation shocked everyone involved. Vincent Blackwood Jr. had returned with a briefcase full of family documents, business records, correspondence, and financial statements that his grandfather and father had maintained in the family's private safe. As Agent Walsh examined the materials, her expression grew increasingly grim. Mr. Blackwood, she said carefully, when did you last audit your family's current business operations? We conduct annual reviews with our accounting firm. Why do you ask? Agent Walsh showed him a document from his own briefcase, a modern bank statement dated just 3 months earlier. The account showed regular deposits that matched no legitimate business activity on Blackwood Industries' official books. This appears to be income from ongoing fraudulent operations. According to these records, someone has been continuing the same predatory lending schemes your grandfather pioneered, targeting vulnerable families with the same techniques Morrison documented. In the 1950s, the modern bank statement that Ben had initially overlooked among Morrison's older documents suddenly took on critical importance. Father Morrison hadn't just documented historical crimes. He had somehow predicted that the pattern would continue, and he had been right. Blackwood stared at the statement with growing horror. This account, I don't recognize it. It's not part of our official corporate structure. Agent Walsh turned to a fresh page in her notepad. Who has access to your family's business operations? Who could be running schemes like this without your knowledge? Blackwood's voice was barely a whisper. My cousin, Richard Blackwood. He's been managing day-to-day operations while I focus on the charitable foundation and civic responsibilities. He said he wanted to protect me from the mundane details of business management. The truth was emerging in a way none of them had anticipated. Vincent Blackwood Jr. appeared to be a victim of his own family's criminal legacy, manipulated by relatives who had continued their ancestors' crimes while maintaining the facade of respectability that protected their operations. Agent Walsh requested immediate access to Blackwood Industries' complete financial records. Within hours, federal accountants were uncovering evidence of systematic fraud that dwarfed even Morrison's historical documentation. The predatory lending schemes had evolved with modern technology, targeting immigrant communities, elderly homeowners, and small business owners with sophisticated methods that generated millions in illegal profits. But the most shocking discovery came when agents executed a search warrant at Richard Blackwood's private residence. Hidden in his home office were detailed files on every family that had been victimized over the past 20 years, including extensive surveillance records on potential threats to the operation. Among those files was a thick folder labeled Morrison Investigation. The folder contained photographs of Mark and Ben entering the library, transcripts of conversations that could only have been obtained through illegal surveillance, and detailed plans for eliminating what Richard Blackwood had termed the Morrison problem. Agent Walsh showed Mark the surveillance photos with barely controlled anger. "They've been watching you since the day after you found Morrison's evidence, your visit to the library, your meeting with Sarah Rodriguez, your arrival at this farmhouse. They've documented everything." Mark stared at images of himself and Ben walking through Millbrook, completely unaware they were being monitored by criminals who viewed them as expendable obstacles. The violation felt profound and terrifying. But Ben, studying the photographs with his characteristic analytical attention, noticed something the adults had missed. "Dad, look at the dates on these pictures. They started watching us before we found Father Morrison's box." Agent Walsh examined the photo timestamps more carefully. Ben was right. The earliest surveillance photos were dated 2 days before their discovery of Morrison's evidence. Someone had been monitoring Mark and Ben from the moment they took shelter in the abandoned church. "They weren't responding to your investigation," Agent Walsh realized. "They were preventing it. Someone knew Morrison's evidence was hidden in that church, and they were watching to make sure no one ever found it." The implications were staggering. The Blackwood family's criminal enterprise hadn't just continued Father Morrison's predicted pattern. It had evolved into something far more sophisticated and dangerous. They had been actively suppressing the historical truth while committing new crimes on an industrial scale. Richard Blackwood was arrested that evening, along with 6 associates who had been operating the modern predatory lending scheme. The evidence against them was overwhelming, thanks partially to Morrison's historical documentation, but primarily to the contemporary records they had been careless enough to maintain. Vincent Blackwood Jr. agreed to cooperate fully with the federal investigation, offering to testify against his criminal relatives and provide complete access to family records. His shock at learning about his family's true history appeared genuine, and Agent Walsh believed his cooperation would be crucial for unraveling decades of complex financial crimes. As Mark and Ben prepared for bed in their secure farmhouse accommodations, they reflected on how completely their understanding had been transformed. They had begun their investigation believing they were exposing historical crimes committed by dead people. Instead, they had uncovered ongoing criminal operations that were actively destroying lives in their own community. The modern bank statement that had seemed like a minor piece of Morrison's collection turned out to be the key that unlocked everything. Father Morrison had somehow obtained evidence of crimes that were still being committed, demonstrating a prescience that bordered on prophetic. "He knew," Ben said softly as he organized his sketches from the day. "Father Morrison knew they would. And keep doing it. That's why he hid the evidence so carefully. He knew someday someone would need it to stop them." Mark looked at his son, this remarkable boy who had discovered the evidence, documented their investigation, and helped bring justice to families who had been victimized for generations. Ben's notebook now contained sketches and observations that would become part of one of the largest white-collar crime prosecutions in the state's history. Outside their farmhouse window, federal agents maintained their protective surveillance, ensuring that the modern Blackwood criminal enterprise couldn't eliminate the witnesses who had finally exposed their decades of hidden crimes. The truth that Father Morrison had died protecting was spreading beyond anyone's ability to contain. The FBI's investigation moved with startling speed once Richard Blackwood's arrest opened the floodgates of evidence. Within 72 hours, federal agents had executed search warrants at 17 different locations, uncovering a criminal enterprise that had systematically defrauded thousands of families over 2 decades. Agent Walsh established a command center at the farmhouse, coordinating with prosecutors from 3 different federal districts as they built cases for fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy charges. The dining room table was covered with organizational charts, showing the connections between Richard Blackwood's operation and legitimate businesses throughout the region. "It's brilliant and evil in equal measure," Agent Walsh explained to Mark. And Ben, as she traced the money flow through dozens of shell companies and offshore accounts. They used the family's legitimate charitable foundation to identify vulnerable targets, then employed predatory lending schemes that were technically legal but morally bankrupt. Ben studied the complex diagrams with his characteristic attention to detail, occasionally asking questions that helped clarify connections the adults had missed. His artistic training allowed him to visualize patterns and relationships in ways that proved invaluable to the investigation. "How many families were hurt?" Ben asked quietly. Agent Walsh consulted her notes. "Based on the records we've recovered so far, at least 3,000 families over the past 20 years. The financial damage totals over $200 million in fraudulent profits, but the human cost is incalculable." The victim families Morrison had documented in the 1950s were being contacted by federal investigators, many of them learning for the first time that their family stories of lost property and broken dreams had been documented by a priest who had died trying to expose the truth. Maria Hayes Thompson had become an unofficial coordinator for the historical victims, helping agents trace family histories and identify potential restitution claims. But it was the contemporary victims who presented the most urgent concerns. Many were still trapped in fraudulent loans, facing foreclosure or bankruptcy because of Richard Blackwood's schemes. Federal prosecutors were working to freeze assets and halt collection activities while they built their criminal cases. Vincent Blackwood Jr. had become an essential prosecution witness, providing access to family records and business documents that revealed the full scope of the criminal enterprise. His genuine shock at learning about his family's true history had evolved into a fierce determination to make amends for crimes committed in his name. "I spent 40 years believing I was continuing a proud family legacy of business success and community service," he told Mark during one of their meetings at the farmhouse. "Learning that it was all built on theft and fraud has been devastating, but it's also liberating. I can finally use our resources to help the families we harmed instead of continuing to harm them." The Blackwood Charitable Foundation, which had operated as a front for identifying vulnerable targets, was being restructured to provide direct assistance to fraud victims. Vincent had liquidated his personal assets and pledged the family's legitimate business interests to fund restitution payments that would help families recover from decades of financial manipulation. Margaret Chen had taken a leave of absence from the library to work full-time on historical research for the case. Her expertise in local records and property history proved invaluable as prosecutors traced the evolution of Blackwood criminal activities across 3 generations. "The pattern is consistent," she explained to the prosecution team. "Each generation refined the techniques but maintained the same basic approach: identify vulnerable people, exploit their desperation, steal their assets, and use the profits to buy respectability that protected them from scrutiny." Sarah Rodriguez was coordinating civil litigation on behalf of victim families, building class action lawsuits that would seek damages beyond what the criminal cases could provide. Her office had been relocated to a secure facility after the break-in, but she continued her work with characteristic determination. "This is why I became a lawyer," she told Mark, as they prepared witness testimony for the upcoming grand jury proceedings. "Cases like this remind me that the legal system can actually deliver justice when good people are willing to fight for it." As the investigation progressed, Mark found himself dealing with conflicting emotions about their role in exposing the Blackwood crimes. The evidence was overwhelming, the victims' suffering was real, and justice clearly demanded prosecution of the criminal enterprise. But he also felt sympathy for Vincent Blackwood Jr., whose life had been built on lies he had never suspected. Ben seemed to understand the moral complexity better than the adults around him. "Vincent isn't bad like his cousin," he observed while sketching the family organizational charts. "He was tricked too. That doesn't make him not responsible, but it makes him different from the people who knew they were stealing." The boy's insight impressed Agent Walsh, who had been working these types of cases for decades. "You're going to make an excellent detective someday," she told Ben, "or maybe an excellent lawyer. You understand people and evidence equally well." Ben's notebook had become an official part of the FBI evidence file, his sketches and observations documenting their investigation in ways that complemented the formal law enforcement records. Federal prosecutors were planning to use his artistic documentation as demonstrative evidence during trial, showing the human story behind the complex financial crimes. The breakthrough in the case came when agents discovered Richard Blackwood's private safe in a storage facility outside town. The safe contained Morrison's original correspondence with federal authorities from 1952, proving that the priest's evidence had indeed reached the right people, but had been intercepted and suppressed before official investigations could begin. More significantly, the safe contained detailed records of other potential witnesses who had been intimidated, bribed, or eliminated over the decades when they posed threats to the criminal enterprise. Father Morrison had been just one of several people who had died trying to expose Blackwood family crimes. "We're dealing with a criminal organization that has been murdering witnesses for 70 years, Agent Walsh told Mark grimly. "The fact that you and Ben survived your investigation is probably due to pure luck and their overconfidence that they could control the situation." The evidence from Richard Blackwood's safe led to additional arrests and expanded the investigation into a multi-state federal case involving organized crime statutes. What had begun with Mark and Ben's discovery of historical documents had uncovered one of the most extensive and long-running criminal enterprises in the region's history. As they prepared for the grand jury proceedings that would formally authorize prosecution of the Blackwood criminal enterprise, Mark reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this point. A week ago, he and Ben had been homeless and desperate, sleeping in an abandoned church because they had nowhere else to go. Now they were key federal witnesses in a case that would reshape their community and deliver justice to thousands of victims. Ben had been formally recognized as a civilian consultant to the FBI, his artistic skills and observational abilities making him an essential part of the investigation team. The grand jury would meet in 3 days, considering evidence that spanned nearly a century and involved crimes that had destroyed countless families. Morrison's wooden box, which had sat hidden beneath the altar of St. Matthew's Episcopal Church for 7 decades, would finally serve its intended purpose. But first, Mark and Ben would need to testify about their discovery and the evidence they had preserved. Agent Walsh had prepared them thoroughly for the process, but nothing could fully prepare them for the responsibility of speaking for victims who had been silenced for generations. The FBI evidence file that would be presented to the grand jury filled 17 boxes and included thousands of pages of financial records, victim testimonies, and supporting documentation. At the heart of it all was Father Morrison's confession letter, the document that had started their investigation and led to the exposure of crimes that might otherwise have continued indefinitely. Ben spent the evening before their testimony, organizing his notebook, making sure his sketches and observations were arranged in chronological order. His artistic documentation of their journey would become part of the permanent court record, preserved for history alongside Morrison's original evidence. "Are you nervous?" Mark asked his son as they prepared for bed. Ben considered the question. With his characteristic seriousness, "A little, but mostly I'm excited. We're going to help all those families get justice. Father Morrison would be proud of that." Outside their farmhouse window, federal agents maintained their protective surveillance, ensuring that the witnesses who had exposed the Blackwood criminal enterprise would live to see justice delivered. Tomorrow, they would begin the formal process of holding accountable a family whose crimes had shaped their community for 3 generations. The abandoned church, where their investigation had begun, now sat empty again. Its secrets finally revealed and its purpose fulfilled. St. Matthew's Episcopal Church had sheltered Mark and Ben when they needed sanctuary, and in return they had given voice to the truth that Father Morrison had died trying to preserve. The grand jury's deliberation lasted less than 2 hours. When they returned to the courthouse, the foreman announced their decision with quiet dignity. "We find probable cause exists to believe that criminal violations have occurred, and we authorize prosecution of the defendants on all charges presented." The federal arrest warrant that followed encompassed not just Richard Blackwood and his immediate associates, but 17 other individuals who had participated in the criminal enterprise over the past 2 decades. Federal agents executed the arrests simultaneously across 3 states, ensuring that key participants couldn't flee or destroy additional evidence. Vincent Blackwood Jr. was not among those arrested. His cooperation with federal investigators and his genuine shock at learning about his family's crimes had convinced prosecutors that he was a victim rather than a perpetrator of the fraud schemes. But his willingness to testify against his criminal relatives would make him a crucial prosecution witness. Mark and Ben watched the arrest proceedings from the federal courthouse's observation deck, surrounded by victim families and community, members who had gathered to witness the culmination of their investigation. Agent Walsh stood beside them, her satisfaction evident as she watched federal marshals lead away criminals who had operated with impunity for decades. "It's over," she told Mark quietly. "The immediate danger is past, and justice is finally being served." But even as the arrests were being completed, Mark felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that the threats against his family had ended, satisfaction that Morrison's evidence had finally served its intended purpose, but also sadness for the communities that had been damaged by generations of systematic fraud. Ben seemed to understand the moment's significance better than many of the adults around him. He had opened his notebook to a fresh page and was sketching the federal agents as they completed their arrests, documenting the final chapter of their investigation with the same careful attention he had given to every other aspect of their journey. "Dad," he said softly, "do you think Father Morrison can see what's happening?" Mark looked at his son, this remarkable boy who had discovered the evidence, preserved the investigation, and helped bring justice to thousands of victims. "I think he can, son, and I think he's very proud of what we accomplished together." The aftermath of the arrests moved quickly. Federal prosecutors announced the charges at a press conference that afternoon, detailing the scope of the criminal enterprise and the evidence that had led to the indictments. Morrison's story was told publicly for the first time, with Mark and Ben recognized as the key witnesses whose discovery had made prosecution possible. Local media coverage was extensive, with newspapers and television stations throughout the region reporting on the investigation that had exposed decades of hidden crimes. The Blackwood name, which had appeared on buildings and charitable foundations throughout the community, was now associated with systematic fraud and witness intimidation. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from the victim families themselves. At a gathering that evening in the courthouse's community room, Mark and Ben were thanked personally by dozens of people whose lives had been damaged by Blackwood criminal activities. "You gave us our voices back," Maria Hayes Thompson told them. "For generations, our families believed we were just unlucky, that we deserved our struggles. Now we know the truth. We were victims of crimes, not failures of character." Vincent Blackwood Jr. attended the gathering, seeking forgiveness from families his relatives had harmed. His presence was initially uncomfortable, but his obvious remorse and his commitment to making restitution gradually won acceptance from some of the victims. "I can't undo the harm my family caused," he told the group, "but I can ensure that every dollar we stole is returned with interest, and that the legitimate parts of our business are used to help rebuild the lives we damaged." The federal restitution fund that Vincent had established would eventually total over $300 million, covering not just direct financial losses, but also the opportunity costs and generational impacts of the fraud schemes. Families would receive settlements that could help them recover from decades of economic hardship caused by criminal exploitation. As the evening concluded, Mark and Ben prepared to leave the courthouse that had been the site of their testimony and the arrests that followed. Their role as key witnesses was essentially complete. They would need to testify at trial, but the immediate crisis had passed. Agent Walsh walked with them to their car, her professional demeanor softened by genuine affection for the father and son who had made her investigation possible. "Where will you go now?" she asked. "Your safety isn't a concern anymore, so you're free to rebuild your lives wherever you choose." It was a question Mark had been considering throughout their weeks. In federal protection, they could start over anywhere, using the victim compensation they would receive to establish new lives far from the community where their troubles had begun. But as he looked at Ben, who was carefully securing his notebook in his backpack, Mark realized they had already found what they had been seeking when they first took shelter in the abandoned church. They had found purpose, meaning, and the satisfaction of using their hardships to help others who had suffered similar injustices. "I think we'll stay in Millbrook," Mark said finally. "This community has been damaged by decades of corruption, but it's also where we found our strength. Maybe we can help rebuild it into something better." Ben nodded approvingly. "And we can visit Father Morrison's church, maybe help fix it up so other people can use it again." Agent Walsh smiled. "That sounds like exactly what Father Morrison would have wanted. His sacrifice finally served its purpose, thanks to both of you." As they drove back to the farmhouse for their final night in federal protection, Mark reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this point. 10 days ago, they had been homeless and desperate, taking shelter in an abandoned church because they had nowhere else to go. Now they were recognized federal witnesses who had helped expose one of the most extensive criminal enterprises in the region's history. Ben's notebook had become part of the official FBI evidence file, his artistic documentation preserving their investigation for legal history. The federal arrest warrant that had authorized the takedown of the Blackwood criminal enterprise sat, framed on Agent Walsh's desk, a testament to the power of ordinary people to seek justice when institutions failed to protect the vulnerable. But more importantly, Mark and Ben had discovered something about themselves during their investigation. They had found courage they didn't know they possessed, determination that survived despite overwhelming obstacles, and the ability to help others even when they seemed powerless to help themselves. Tomorrow, they would begin rebuilding their lives in Millbrook, using the skills and insights they had gained during their investigation to contribute positively to a community that was finally free from the criminal family that had exploited it for generations. The abandoned church where their journey began would soon be restored, transformed from a forgotten relic into a community center that could serve families who needed support and assistance. Father Morrison's legacy would live on not just in the justice that had finally been served, but in the ongoing work of healing and rebuilding that his sacrifice had made possible. 6 months later, Mark stood in the restored sanctuary of St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, watching Ben direct a group of high school volunteers as they hung historical displays documenting the building's remarkable story. The Gothic revival architecture looked magnificent again, with new stained glass windows casting colorful patterns across refinished pews and polished stone floors. The transformation of the abandoned church into the Morrison Community Center had become a symbol of Millbrook's renewal following the exposure of the Blackwood criminal enterprise. Vincent Blackwood Jr. had funded the restoration as part of his restitution efforts, creating a space dedicated to supporting families in crisis and preserving the community's genuine history. Mark had returned to teaching, accepting a position as principal of Jefferson Elementary, with the understanding that his experience had given him unique insights into helping families facing economic hardship. The Victim Compensation Fund had provided financial security that allowed him to focus on education rather than mere survival, and his story had inspired other educators throughout the district. Ben, now 12, had gained local fame as the young detective whose artistic skills had helped solve a 70-year-old mystery. His notebook from the investigation was displayed in the community center's main exhibit, alongside Father Morrison's original documents and the federal evidence that had brought down the criminal enterprise. "Dad, look at this," Ben called out, pointing to a new display case that had just been installed near the altar. Inside were the new house keys that marked their transformation from homelessness to stability, along with photographs documenting their journey from desperate shelter seekers to federal witnesses. The display included a letter from Agent Walsh, commending their courage and explaining how their investigation had led to one of the most significant white-collar crime prosecutions in federal history. The letter would inspire future visitors who might find themselves in similarly desperate circumstances, showing them that ordinary people could make extraordinary differences when they refused to accept injustice. Margaret Chen had been promoted to director of the Regional Historical Society, using her expertise to help other communities uncover and address their own hidden histories of exploitation and corruption. Her work on the Blackwood case had established her as a nationally recognized expert on using historical research to support contemporary justice initiatives. Sarah Rodriguez had used the success of the Blackwood prosecution to establish a non-profit legal clinic specializing in predatory lending cases. Her organization now helped victims throughout the region, using the legal precedents established during the Blackwood trial to hold other criminal enterprises accountable for their exploitation of vulnerable families. The victim families had used their restitution payments in ways that honored the memory of relatives who had suffered under Blackwood exploitation. Maria Hayes Thompson had established a scholarship fund for children of immigrant families, ensuring that language barriers and cultural differences wouldn't prevent young people from accessing educational opportunities. Vincent Blackwood Jr. had liquidated most of his family's assets to fund restitution payments and community improvement projects. He now worked as a volunteer coordinator for victim assistance programs, using his business experience to help other communities identify and address systematic exploitation before it could cause generational damage. The trials of Richard Blackwood and his associates had concluded with convictions on all major charges. Federal judges had imposed sentences ranging from 15 to 40 years, ensuring that the leaders of the criminal enterprise would spend most of their remaining lives in prison. The message was clear: systematic fraud and witness intimidation would be punished with the full force of federal law, But perhaps the most meaningful recognition had come from the families whose stories had been preserved by Father Morrison's careful documentation. At the community center's dedication ceremony, descendants of every family Morrison had tried to help gathered to honor both the priest who had died protecting their truth and the father and son who had finally brought that truth to light. As evening approached, Mark and Ben walked through the community center's historical exhibits, reflecting on the journey that had brought them from homelessness to hope. The building where they had once slept on dusty floors was now a thriving hub of community activity, serving families who needed assistance and preserving stories that might otherwise be forgotten. Ben's artistic skills had continued to develop, and he now taught weekend classes for other young people interested in using art to document their community's history. His approach combined technical drawing skills with investigative techniques, showing students how careful observation could uncover important truths that adults might overlook. "Do you ever miss the excitement?" Ben asked as they settled into comfortable chairs in the community center's library, the same room where they had made their temporary bedroom during those first desperate nights. Mark considered the question thoughtfully. Their lives were certainly more stable now, but they were also more purposeful. The skills they had developed during their investigation, careful observation, methodical documentation, persistence in pursuing truth, had become valuable tools for helping their community heal from decades of systematic exploitation. "I miss the sense that every day might bring some new discovery," Mark admitted, "but I think what we're doing now is more important. We're helping make sure that what happened to those families can never happen again." The community center's evening programs were beginning, with support groups meeting in various rooms throughout the building. Families dealing with financial crisis, immigrants navigating complex legal systems, and elderly residents protecting themselves from predatory schemes all found resources and assistance in the building where Morrison had once preached and later died, trying to expose corruption. As they prepared to leave for their comfortable home, purchased with victim compensation funds and located just 3 blocks from the community center, Mark and Ben paused at the memorial display honoring Father Morrison's sacrifice. The priest's confession letter was displayed alongside contemporary photographs, showing the positive changes his evidence had ultimately made possible. "He would be proud," Ben said quietly, studying Morrison's carefully written accusations and the federal conviction records that proved his claims had been accurate. Mark nodded, placing his hand on his son's shoulder. "He would be proud of you especially. You saw what adults had missed, you preserved what needed to be saved, and you had the courage to speak truth when it mattered most." Outside, the streets of Millbrook looked much the same as they had 6 months earlier, but the community's character had been fundamentally transformed. The Blackwood name had been removed from buildings and replaced with memorials, honoring the families whose sacrifices had built the town's genuine prosperity. The culture of deference to wealth and power had been replaced by a commitment to transparency and accountability that would protect future generations from similar exploitation. The new house keys that had symbolized their transformation from homelessness to security now opened a door to a life neither Mark nor Ben could have imagined when they first took shelter in the abandoned church. They had found not just housing, but purpose, not just safety, but the satisfaction of using their experience to help others who faced similar challenges. As they walked home through the evening darkness, streetlights illuminating their path, Mark reflected on the profound truth their investigation had revealed. Sometimes the greatest treasures really are found in the most broken places, not gold or jewels, but the opportunity to serve something larger than themselves, to speak for people who had been silenced, and to prove that ordinary families could achieve extraordinary justice when they refused to accept that suffering was inevitable. Ben carried his current notebook under his arm, filled with sketches of their restored community and plans for future projects that could help other families avoid the exploitation they had experienced. His artistic gifts had become tools for social change, documenting both problems that needed attention and solutions that were making positive differences. The abandoned church that had given them shelter had been transformed into a community resource that would serve families for generations. Father Morrison's sacrifice had finally achieved its intended purpose, protecting not just historical truth, but ongoing justice for people who deserved better from the institutions that claimed to serve them. Their story had become part of Millbrook's official history, preserved in the community center's archives alongside Morrison's documents and the federal evidence that had brought down the criminal enterprise. Future visitors would learn how a desperate father and his observant son had discovered evidence that changed their community forever, proving that anyone could make a difference when they combined courage with careful attention to truth. Lights were on in their comfortable home as Mark and Ben approached their front door, symbols of the security and stability they had fought to achieve. But more importantly, the lights represented hope for themselves, for the families they continued to help, and for communities everywhere that struggled against systematic exploitation disguised as legitimate business practices. They had found treasure in the most broken place imaginable, not because they were seeking wealth, but because they refused to accept that injustice was permanent. Father Morrison's legacy lived on through their continuing work and through the lives they had helped rebuild with truth, courage, and the persistent belief that everyone deserved better than they were getting.